Hey everyone, Wayne Fox here. I've really been enjoying my new Fuji GFX 100S. Ergonomically, it's way better than the 100 that I had, which was just too bulky and I never used. Image stability is great, so hand holding is great. I don't do it much. It's nice to know that I can if I want to. It's only a few ounces heavier than my Sony system, and yet I have the 100 megapixel sensor in there. Really good glass, really good system. So I'm pretty glad that I decided to switch over to this and move away from the Sony. Sony's still a great system, but I've kind of been a medium format guy for my whole life, ever since film. It's several pounds lighter than the Phase system I had, and even though the Phase system is still by far the best system out there as far as I'm concerned, with that amazing 150 megapixel sensor and some of the technology in the back, which I really miss. If you can't carry the camera into your shoot because it's just too heavy to manage, or if you have to skip going to a location because you just can't get there because it's too heavy to manage, doesn't do you much good to have it. So I'm pretty glad I made the switch. So I was out with my new camera last fall taking this picture of these aspen tree trunks, and I tried to use the feature in the camera called focus bracketing. It's supposed to automate the ability to create a focus stack that you can assemble later in Photoshop or Lightroom, Photoshop or Helicon Focus. And I was really confused. I set it up to go manual and it asked me this thing about steps. What's a step? I had no clue. I had the book on my phone, so I tried to look it up there. So this wasn't much help. It tells me that step values translate to smaller changes in focus, large to large changes. Well, that's pretty obvious. But what's a small change? What's a large change? When do I need to use a small? When do I need to use a large? Absolutely no help from the book. Really couldn't figure it out from there. So I thought, well, let me try automatic. And the automatic was confusing because I kept doing what it says. It says, OK, set point B, OK, set point A. I kept pressing OK and nothing happened. And, at that point, the light was changing. I just gave up and I did it the old-fashioned way. I just decided to take focus on each tree trunk and then put them together later, which, of course, is the technique I've used many times in the past. So since then, I've done quite a bit of testing on this concept, and I think I understand what a step is now. So I thought I'd make the video go through the whole idea of focus bracketing and stacking, why we do it, when we do it, with some examples of times I have done it or I haven't done it and I should have done it. And then I'll get into the whole how you do it on a Fuji camera and specifically what the heck a step is. Once you understand what a step is, or at least what I think a step is, it's a little bit easier to make a decision. And to be honest, most of the time you don't have to make a decision. You can just put it on 10. But we'll get into that. So let's go ahead and get into focus bracketing and focus stacking, why and when, and some examples. So focus bracketing is a technique, you probably already know this, where we take a series of images changing the plane of focus of the camera. We're normally on a tripod. The scene has got to be pretty static, can't be a lot of movement. You can fix some movement later in post-processing. But we take that series of images, stack them in software like Photoshop, Helicon Focus. Software takes the sharpest parts of each image, and the end result is an image which has greater depth of field than the camera is capable of. A lot of times you really don't need it, just depends on what you're shooting, and to be honest, most of the time when I need it, it's a scene like the one I just showed you of those aspen trees. It's not something that goes off to infinity, but sometimes you have a foreground element. This is a good example right here. I took a nice shot, but you'll notice that the bush in the foreground is blurry. Didn't have enough depth of field, and a quick several shot focus stack, maybe only 2 or 3 shots, could have resolved that. I don't really like a blurry bush in the foreground of my images like this. Here's a shot I took, and this I used a technique called the Scheimpflug effect with a view camera, which works sometimes as long as the scene doesn't have any trees or anything sticking up in the foreground. But I could have accomplished the same thing with a focus stack. Another one similar, all the flowers are sharp from the one right closest to the lens, which isn't very far away, all the way to the trees in infinity. So focus bracket would have actually taken care of this as well. This again was with the Scheimpflug effect. Here's one I used a focus bracket similar to that one I started with. I just focused on each aspen tree, assembled them later. Maybe 1 or 2 more examples. Here's a really nice image, and I didn't need to do anything special here. I'm far enough away and I'm using a fairly wide lens on this that there's no problem getting everything sharp in this image. And most of the time in landscape work, especially when we're dealing with grand vistas, that's the situation you're going to find yourself in. But here's an example. Again, this is more of a close-up, and this is where I find myself using focus stacks more often. When I printed this for a client about 80 inches long, one of these 2 white tree trunks is just a little tiny bit soft. And I could have shot just a quick 2 or 3 shot bracket, changing my focus very slightly and been able to resolve that pretty easily. So it's really a useful technique. So there are several ways to shoot a focus bracket manually. It's how we used to do it. One, you can just focus on different points in your scene, just turn the lens until something's sharp. Fuji right now, you've got a touchscreen focus. I could just touch different elements. That's what I ended up doing with those aspen trees. I just would touch each tree and it would change focus to that. Another thing you could do is you could put one of these little things on your lens and you could do what I used to do. And this is really useful on a scene like Badwater, where you've just got this infinite flat field of salt. I would just start at the closest point, and then I would just turn this lens a tiny, tiny bit each time till I got to infinity. And that was a pretty effective technique. And to be honest, focus bracketing in cameras now, which most digital cameras include a feature called focus bracketing that automates that. That's really kind of what they're doing. They're just saying, let's just start at the sharp point and let's just move it a little bit each time until we get to wherever we determine the end point should be. Okay, so I've set up a little scene. We're going to shoot a couple of focus brackets here using the Fuji's focus bracket function. And when we get to the steps setting, we can talk about what exactly I think is going on there. The first thing you have to do is tell the camera to actually shoot a bracket. It's one thing that is easy to overlook. If you have a Fuji camera with a drive button, just press that button, scroll down till you have BKT highlighted, scroll over till you have focus bracket highlighted, and you're good to go. If you have a Fuji camera that doesn't have the drive button, then you'll have a BKT setting on your dial. Once you do that, you need to go into the menu, which allows you to select what type of bracket you want to shoot. Make sure you go through the process. I think it's 3 different steps here, and you've got to say, I want to shoot a focus bracket. If you don't do that, even though you set up your focus bracket settings, it actually won't shoot it. Clue is you push the button, it only takes 1 shot. Easy to overlook, especially if you have the BKT setting, but I've done it here many times. I've gone to shoot a bracket. Now what I do is I have C6 specifically set to shoot a focus bracket. So all I need to do is go to C6, it's all good to go. Electronic shutter set, everything's set, and the only thing I have to do is set up the actual bracket itself. So now that we've told it we want to shoot a bracket, before we actually go in and set up the bracket settings, we want to focus on our close point. If we're doing a manual bracket, it's sometimes difficult to tell your close point. And one thing you can do is if you think you've focused close enough, but you're not quite sure, just focus a little further. And then when you go into Lightroom, you can go through, and any ones that are in front that are completely blurry, you can just toss later. It's a little difficult sometimes to get the very edge of the focus set. In the case like this, I've got this cloth that recedes to the background. And if you notice here, if I try to zoom in to focus on this cloth, if I go to my different zoom settings, look at how the watch moves away. And only on my second zoom setting can I see completely below the watch to the actual edge of the frame. As I zoom in more, now I can't see the edge of the frame. So if you need to see that very, very, very edge, in the GFX 100 anyway, you've got to use that second zoom setting. If you're not worried about it, you can use any one you want, obviously. But we're going to use the second one, and I've got focus peaking turned on, and we're just going to focus so that those red highlights go to the bottom of the cloth. And now we've got it set. Once we've got that set, we're ready to go in and set up our bracket settings. On the camera here, I can do that in 3 different ways. I can go to the camera menu here, and at the bottom you'll see I have focus bracket settings. In my case, I use it often enough that I put it into my menu, and now you see it's right there. I also use gestures on my camera, and so if I swipe from the right, whoops, and sometimes that just messes up your focus. If I swipe from the right, then I get into my focus bracket settings. We're going to start with a manual one here. Now, I don't know how many frames it's going to take to do this watch. We're going to do it at an increment of 5 steps. We'll get to that in just a second. But this is how many frames it's going to shoot, and it's going to increment whatever step setting we have each time. I think it's probably going to take, if I shoot at step 5, it's probably going to take around 250 steps, maybe even more, and you'll kind of understand why in a minute. To be safe, let's just go ahead and go to 300 steps. Let's talk about interval next, and then we'll get to steps. Interval is how long the camera will delay between each shot. And with a focus bracket, you can typically use electronic shutter. Now on the larger format sensors like the GFX, there's a little issue with using electronic shutter if there's a lot of movement, because the scan rate of the sensor is just not fast enough. I think with the smaller cameras, it's not as big a deal. With a focus bracket, it's a pretty static subject, so most of the time you can just use electronic shutter, and that's what I would recommend. If you decide to use first curtain, electronic first curtain, or even a manual shutter, I don't know how much shutter shock there is. It depends a little bit on how solid your tripod is, but if you really are trying to get things tack sharp, then you might want to go to a 1 second delay in the interval. Okay, so now we have to decide what step setting to use. And to understand what a step is, at least what I think it is, or at least an analogy that probably works pretty well, if we go back and look at lens development over the years, in the original cameras, they were just manual focus, and you simply would turn a dial and it would focus the lens. You had a distance indicator on the top, pretty straightforward. Later, autofocus came along, and of course, with an autofocus lens, a lot of times it still works manual. You can still take the lens, you can still turn it, there's still a distance indicator, but you can also pop the lens into an automatic mode for autofocus. And this is where a motor engages, and a motor will be turning the lens instead of you. But the lens mechanism that turns it is still mechanical, and the motor is just assisting that. When we get to the Fuji lenses and a lot of modern lenses, there's no more mechanical action of focus. It's strictly controlled by the motor. The focus ring here on this lens on my Fuji camera, if I turn the power off to the camera, it won't change focus at all. Easy enough to check. Let's focus here on the front of the watch. We're going to turn the camera off. We're going to crank the focus ring several times. And we're going to turn the camera back on. And as you can see, focus hasn't changed. There's power to the lens now, when we turn the lens, we engage that motor. And once the motor is engaged, it can move it. Now that motor is called a stepper motor. Stepper motors are everywhere. They're incredibly precise, very reliable, very long lasting. Stepper motors and a special form of stepper motor called an actuator are in almost everything we use now that's automated. Robotics, inkjet printers, those are stepper motors that control all that stuff. If you think about how small of an increment a stepper motor has to be, you can understand why the lens itself might use a step as a reference to the stepper motor. Now, I don't know if it's a direct correlation, if one step correlates to one step of the stepper motor. It could be that the stepper motor actually is more fine than that, and Fuji has determined that we need to move this lens so many steps total, and the mechanism is capable of that. So every 4 steps of the motor is going to be 1 step of equivalent in our focusing mechanism. But the concept of a step, meaning the smallest amount of focus change the lens is capable of, same thing as trying to take a manual lens and moving it a fraction of a millimeter at a time. That's really, really small. And I think that helps us understand what a step is and why we're probably never going to use a setting of 1, and maybe not even ever use a setting of other than 10. Just to give you a frame of reference on that, if we take this particular lens here, for example, my 120 macro, and I focus it to the closest point, put the lens cap on so it's not really using any data, it's basically referencing moving that focusing mechanism with the motor, and it knows where the beginning and the end point is. And we step through it. It takes almost 6,000 steps to get from the closest focus point to infinity with this particular lens. Now, each lens is different. A wide-angle lens won't require near as many steps because they have much more depth of field. Each step changes the focus a little more dramatically. For example, at 32 millimeters on the 32 to 64, that only takes 212 steps to move through the entire range of focus. If you move it to 64 millimeters, it now takes 620 steps to move it through the entire range of focus. So I'm not sure how Fuji's actually calculated it, but it does seem a good analogy that a step is just the smallest amount you can focus. Has nothing to do with anything sharp. It's not 20% of a focus change. It's simply the smallest amount of focus change that can be. And when I get right down to it and do the testing, that's really small. So if I tested my 64 millimeter at its closest range, 1 step is equal to about 1/4 of an inch of focus change on a ruler. And once I go down that ruler, if I'm at f8 or f11, then I don't need to go 1 step at a time. When would you ever use 1 step? That seems kind of puzzling, but I do think if you were doing ultra macro work, have some extension tubes on, you got a little insect or some small piece of jewelry that's, maybe 1 inch away from your lens, you have 0 depth of field there. And even at f8 or f11, you might need to take one step at a time through 200 or 300 shots to get that in focus. So for me, that's what a step is. That's the analogy that I think works the best. And once we understand that, we can see that probably as a landscape photographer, we're not going to use anything other than 10. The only exception might be is if you've got, for example, you're doing a study of maybe some pebbles on the ground and you've got your lens and your focus as close as your camera can get, 1.8 feet or whatever, and you're trying to get to 3 feet, you might need to go less than 5. In a case like that, if you're not sure, just use a smaller number, use 2 steps, 3 steps, even 1 step. It's pretty easy to go into Lightroom and just change the width of your icons and just take the first row and take every third step, every third shot. I keep calling them steps now. Every fourth shot, every fifth shot. We're going to do that in this test here. We're going to take more steps than we need and closer, and then we're going to use every other step to decide if 5 was good, if 10 was good enough, or if 5 was necessary. So anyway, let's go ahead and shoot this manual bracket now that we kind of understand it. Okay, so we focused on our near point. Let's go to our settings. Focus bracket setting, manual. We're going to shoot 5. I'm going to shoot it at f4 to get my depth of field sort of the minimum. If we were at f8, it would obviously dramatically change how many steps we need, probably cut them in half. We're going to go with a 0-second interval. Let's just double check our settings here. As you can see, I'm shooting a normal JPEG. I've got electronic first curtain. I don't want to use that, so let's go change that to electronic shutter. And I'm good to go. And we're going to take, I think I said set at 300. Let's go ahead and shoot this bracket here. Now this will shoot really fast because we're just shooting JPEGs. Most of the time, if you're doing a focus stack, focus bracket, you're going to probably be shooting in RAW. Now I've got a little extra, my iPhone set up as an HDMI monitor here, which is considerably larger. It's almost twice as big. And I can see the focus moving back. Now, one thing you can do in a case like this, if you see that you've gone past the focus because you weren't sure how many shots to take, you can stop the bracket at any time by just pushing the OK button, and that will stop it. Looks to me like we're almost to the back of the watch. So the one thing you'll do in a case like this, if you want to make sure you got past the farthest point, is just go ahead and push your play button and then zoom in on that shot. And we don't need to zoom in quite that far. Let's see. There we go. And then just scroll up. And as you can see, the back of my watch is now blurry. So I went past the point I needed to. I can go into Lightroom later and I can delete those. I'll just find the one that the last focus point is and then delete the rest of them. Might even have to do that at the beginning once in a while, as I explained earlier. One thing I might mention is, in a practical perspective, as a landscape photographer, that's what you're doing. You hardly ever need to use anything other than 10, other than the studies I talked about earlier. And the cool part is you can set it up to be manual because you just focus on the nearest thing, put it at step 10, put 999 shots in there and hit the button. That's really about as simple as it can be. You're going to have plenty of sharpness, especially if you're at f8, and it'll be plenty of shots to get your focus stack, because the camera will stop when it gets to infinity. It usually only takes 8, 10, 12 shots, maybe 15 to 20 if you've got something even a little closer, like a little bush. Okay, so a couple of tips. At least this is how I've found works really well. If I'm trying to do a bracket which has a kind of a specific range, say 3 to 8 feet, 3 to 10 feet, that's really a good time for an autofocus bracket. Focus on the close tree, focus on the far tree, kind of like those aspen shots earlier in the video when I started the video. That's a great time for an auto bracket. If, on the other hand, I'm going to be anywhere in the distance with my far point, I'm not going to bother trying to set that up. What I'm going to do is use a manual bracket. I'm going to set my near point. Then I'm going to let the camera just shoot all the way through infinity. Now, if I want the distance blurry for some reason, I can always delete the last few shots and it will use the softness of the shots in front as though I set up and stopped early, just like if I did an autofocus bracket. But autofocus bracket is really ideal for those cases where you kind of got a definite range. A couple of examples. Remember the one with the 2 white aspen trees? That would have been a good one for an auto bracket. A lot of times you don't even want to use the focus bracket settings on the camera. You just want to do it manually. A good example was the Grand Canyon shot I had. The best thing I could have done there is touch my focus point on the bush, got the bush sharp, touch my focus point to get the rest of it sharp. 2 shots would have got it all bracketed in. I don't need this step, and all this work to merge them. So before we set up the autofocus bracket, let's talk a little bit about the tip that I promised in the title of the video. I think this is very useful if you're a Fuji shooter. You know, if I'm out shooting a landscape image and I suddenly realize that I don't have enough depth of field unless I go to f/22, but the light's low enough that then I've got a 1 minute exposure time or 30-second or whatever. So, and I usually don't like to shoot at 22. I'd prefer to stay at 8 or 11, but you know, sometimes you have to. But I might not have the time to set up my focus bracket so I can get that foreground object sharp if I want to shoot at f8 and still get the image because the light is changing really, really fast. Fortunately, the camera remembers a couple of things, and because of that, I can set up and shoot a focus bracket just pretty much the same amount of time it takes me to shoot a single image if I set up the Fuji camera right. So let's show what I do here. First of all, you'll notice I'm in aperture priority and my drive is set to still image and my settings are set to electronic first curtain and the other settings I tend to use when I'm out shooting. But my C6 is now set up to be a focus bracket, and if I go to C6, you'll notice it already remembers I've got focus bracket selected. So whatever setting is in your drive button, that's retained in your custom settings. The other thing that's remembered is all of the other settings. So for example, electronic shutter is set. Now I have my custom settings set that I have to actually go in and save those settings. I don't have it set so that they dynamically save, but all these settings, normally they're the same as the beginning except for electronic shutter. If you also understand that whatever setting you left focus bracket setting at is retained until you go back into focus bracket settings again, all you've got to do to be able to set up pretty much an instant focus bracket is make sure that whenever you do anything other than like an autofocus bracket, make sure you always leave your camera as a manual focus bracket with 999, 10, and 0. I never need to go into that again unless I want to do an automatic one. Once I do that, now that will be used, whatever the focus bracket setting was the last time you used it, last time the camera, if it was 2 weeks ago, it retains everything. So if you shot an automatic focus bracket from 3 to 7 feet, and then you go and want to shoot a focus bracket again, but you don't actually go and set up your focus bracket settings, that's the setting it will use. If you always leave a manual setting to 999, 10, and 0, you can go to C6, compose, set your exposure, focus on the near point, and push the button, and you will get your focus bracket shot automatically. This is so simple that I don't use autofocus bracket anymore unless the rare occasion I'm doing some close study of some pebbles or something. Even in a case like the aspen trees I showed you, which is ideal for an autofocus bracket, I'll go to C6, focus on the first tree, let it shoot off some shots till everything's blurry. Then I'll stop it, and then I'll go into Lightroom and I'll delete all the ones that were past my back focus point. That would be the same as shooting an automatic bracket, but I didn't have to take the time to set it up. Really useful tip. The key is make sure that you always exit your focus bracket settings with the manual setting. If you ever use an automatic one, go back in, reset it to the manual, and now C6 is ready to shoot a focus bracket anytime you want. It takes no extra time. Okay, so if I go into my focus bracket settings here, one thing I'll mention, if I'm in this screen here, if I use the focus toggle to select the 0, most of the time I can see the A and B points that are actually retained in memory. Now you notice it disappears really quick. If I start focusing my lens, it'll come back, and you'll notice that the A is highlighted. That means it's the one that's being set as I turn the focus ring. Now you can barely see it move. The B is still there. I could actually reset A. That B setting is going to be remembered. If I exit this right now, that'll become the new A setting. So anyway, let's go ahead and set it up here. Now notice as soon as I press OK, what happens? B disappears and is on top of A, and now B is highlighted. So pressing OK doesn't set A, it sets both. Whenever you press OK, both near and far are set to that point. Now we can set up our B. We can go up here. We can either turn our lens to do it, and because we're so close, we can barely tell there's a difference here. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this, And let's just go ahead and turn the ring and try to get those highlights. You can see now I've got some little highlights on the back. And so that means that cloth is what's focused on. And now I'm good to go. Now, I don't have to do anything to actually set that as the B point. It's set. All I've got to do is go out of the menu. Now, you can press the shutter button, and that sometimes works if you want to play it safe, because sometimes it doesn't. I just go back all the way to the menu. Now those are set. My A and B point are set. And it's kind of weird, but that's just kind of how it works. So you're going to press OK to set both A and B, then you're going to focus on B, and then you're just going to move out, because whatever B is what's going to be set. So now we can go ahead and shoot this bracket setting. We're at F4, and if we shoot this, it's going to tell me that it thinks it needs to take about 240 shots to set this bracket. Now, I'm not going to shoot this whole thing because I did it the other day. Let's go ahead and stop this, and let's just make a couple of notes here. So let's focus. You notice I'm focused on the back point now, but when I start the bracket, notice what happens. It starts at your A point, whatever it was. It remembers where it is, and it starts working its way back. Now what I want to do is switch a couple of f-stops. Let's just go to F5.6, and we'll adjust our shutter speed to kind of compensate. And let's see what happens if we shoot the bracket. All the bracket settings are the same, so now it's only going to take about 170 shots. Seems to me it's about a 30% difference. Let's go ahead and stop it there. We're going to go to F8. Now, I don't know at what point it gets to step 10. Theoretically, on auto bracket, you would get to step 10, so no matter what f-stop you used, it wouldn't change. I think when you're in auto bracket, it actually uses more than step 10 sometimes. And let's just kind of see if we can prove that. So now we're at F8. Let's brighten it up a little bit, hit OK. And you'll notice it's going to use about half the shots that it did at F4. Now, it's going to use 122 shots at this setting. If I go all the way to F16 or F22, I should have reached 10 and they should stay the same, but that doesn't happen. No matter what I do, as I close the iris down, it uses less shots and less shots and less shots. Let's go ahead and go all the way down to, we've got it on F22 now. We'll have to use a longer shutter speed to brighten it up. And it's a pretty slow shutter speed. At F22, let's see how many shots it thinks it needs. Only 44 shots. So there's no way that we're not past step 10. We're using 15 or 20. So in auto bracket, it actually isn't limited by that setting of 10. Personally, I wish Fuji would give me a 15 and a 20, because I think a lot of times those would be very usable numbers. Anyway, that's how we set up an autofocus bracket. Let's go ahead and head over to the computer and take a look at some of our results. This won't take too long. Give you an idea of what step setting would have worked. I think it's pretty enlightening. And then we'll be done. Okay, so let's just kind of look at the results, try to figure out, does step 10 work all the time, etc. Not going to get into a lot of detail on actually creating a focus stack and merging it. That's for another video. The one thing I'll mention is that when you notice when I shot the brackets, everybody recommends you like take a picture of hand to start and end, things like that. I always forgot that all the time, but now I don't bother anymore, because anytime I'm taking any kind of a sequence, whether it's a pano sequence, I make sure that I am fairly consistent on taking the shots, and then I leave enough time between the two that I can use Lightroom's auto stack feature. For example, here you see all of the shots I took. There's 830 shots. If I select all and I right click and I go to stacking, I go down to auto stack by capture time, make sure I've got 2 or 3 seconds in there. It's going to actually group these into the 4 brackets that I shot. Boom, just like that. So no real reason to shoot a picture of your hand or anything. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up this stack of 300, and I want to find the shot where the focus ends and I don't really need to use anymore. Now I actually marked that. If we go through here, it was about 230, and you see that I've all these that I marked in red. So this is a point that I felt that I was focused on this cloth in the back of the watch, and I really didn't need to use any of the other shots. So what I did was I just selected all of those from the beginning to this point, and then I made a collection rather than delete them. It's interesting to note that my manual bracket, once I eliminated the shots that were past the rear focus point, I ended up with almost exactly the same number of shots as the autofocus bracket, which tells me that the autofocus bracket was actually using step 5 like I did in this bracket. So if I go down here, this is my collection. This is 239. So basically this is at step 5. And what I then did is I took this collection and I set it up so that I had an even number in each row, and I selected every other one. And now I just selected down this way and up. And it's a little bit tedious, but basically I went through and created a selection of every other shot and saved that as a collection. This would be the same as if I would have shot at step 10. Basically, I used every other one, so I didn't have to shoot at step 10. And then I did the same thing using every third shot. So this is the same as if I would have used step 15, which isn't even available in the camera. And one more time, using every fourth shot. So this is the same as if I would have used step 20. Now we're using a macro lens here that has a lot more steps, but we're not using it as even near its extreme closeness. I'm 8 or 10 inches away probably from its closest focus point. I don't think I need to use 5. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that maybe even 20 will work. So I created stacks of all those. Let's just take a look at the results. So if you create a set skipping shots, like every fourth shot, every fifth shot, it's important you still include the last shot in your stack because it's the one that might have the final point focused and you will lose that. So when you get down to the last one, if there's only 2 shots away, still pick that last shot. Now here I've got all 4 stacks. This one here is from my original 259 shots, very sharp. I zoom in, as you can see, you really can't find any point that's blurry, but every little detail down to even this little tiny hair right there. Well, how does that compare if we eliminate every other one, same as shooting at step 10? Let's go to comparison here. So this is step 10, and notice that we really don't see any change at all. I'll scroll around to a few different points on this watch. Notice the printing in the text, the back buckle. What about if we went to step 15? Well, let's go there. This is step 15. Again, I can't see any real difference. Now, part of this might be because it's a macro lens, and so we got so many more settings. I don't know if you can go to step 15, especially at a really close focus range on a normal lens. Let's just go to 20 and see what we get. All right, and if we compare it to 20, even at 20, which is, like I said, the lens isn't even capable of, we get a pretty good stack. Now, these were all stacked with Helicon Focus in its default settings. And it took, the fewer the pictures, the quicker it did the focus stack. So one more quick thing, just kind of to substantiate some of the stuff I said earlier in the video. Here you can see that I've got this shot that I set up, and I did a lot of testing with this. And I focused at the edge of the table with my 64 millimeter, moving the camera so I'm actually at my minimum focus distance with that 64 millimeter. Now, this isn't the first shot in the stack. Basically, what I did is I picked the first one where the 1 inch mark was sharp. And as I step through these, you'll notice that I'm only going to move about 1/8 of an inch at a time. And it takes me 8 full steps or 9 steps so that my 2 inch mark is sharp. This is at f4. I was saying, if you're at the extreme edge of your focus range, you might need to use something less than 5. If you're in doubt, shoot more and then skip every other one or whatever. But I just kind of wanted to demonstrate that. Obviously, if you shoot at f8, you're going to be able to go 1/4 of an inch or more. If you're at the very extreme end of your focus range, you're at 1.8 feet or whatever that minimum distance is, especially with a telephoto, the more likely it is you need to use a smaller step setting. But other than that, I haven't found many cases where 10 isn't enough. Well, sorry that the video was kind of long. I just wanted to cover everything real thoroughly. Didn't want to make 2 videos out of this. I did try to put some good chapter markers in there so you can skip parts that were not appealing to you or interesting. But if you have any questions, just hit me below. I'll try to get to those. I try to watch for those. And until the next time, when I have a video about the Axoon CMO, which is a little device you saw on my camera, and whether I like it in the field or not, I'll see you.